Giuseppe Mastruzzo, speaking from the International University College of Turin, in one of Italy's COVID red zones. My conversation with you will be about life whose meaning has been lost. I will argue here at length that while the consideration for the loss of lives is well present in the debate triggered by the current pandemic, less present is the consideration of life in its full human meaning, as understood by many at the beginning of this third millennium. I will rapidly associate the human meaning of life with the notion of the commons as open spaces of sociability that are essential to our full development as human personae. Let me acknowledge, first of all, that I am partly indebted for my reflections to different authors that have partaken in the COVID debate, and in particular, to some notes by Giorgio Agamben. Let me also acknowledge that this year we are sacrificing practically everything: normal living conditions, social relationships, work, even friendships, personal affections, and political convictions in order not to fall ill. The fear of losing our lives is producing a loss of communal life that blinds us and separates us. Other human beings must now be kept at a distance. Our neighbor has been cancelled, and our face is now a standard mask. What do human relationships become in a world that gets used to living like this? And what is a society that has no other value than survival? I will start my reflections by quoting the state of food security and nutrition in the world, a report prepared every year by the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Last year, in 2019, prior to the global coronavirus state of exception, some 690 million people in the world went undernourished. This is some 9% of the global population. This figure has unfailingly been decreasing in recent years. On the contrary, projections based on the latest available global economic outlooks suggest that the COVID-19 pandemic will add up to 132 million people to the ranks of the undernourished in 2020. This means that because of the restrictions to ordinary life and to ordinary rights triggered everywhere in the world by the current pandemic, this year the people who were forced to a life of hunger went up to 1.5% of the world population. 1.5% more of the world population are now hungry. Many of these people are young or very young. By contrast, the number of coronavirus victims to date is far less than 0.02% of the world population. These victims are mainly old and very old people, and the majority of them already presented one or more underlying health conditions. If you take the case of Germany, for instance, less than 1% of COVID victims are younger than 50 years of age, and well over half of them are older than 80. These data are provided by the statistical website. I am arguing here that the dramatic measures taken worldwide to contain the current pandemic are meant to guarantee a basic human right, the right to life. However, this right to life is meaningless if we do not ask ourselves when life can be understood as fully human as we understand it in the 21st century. Today, the human right to life, in fact, makes sense only when informed by other rights that make that life humanly worth being lived and make that right to life full. People reduced to their pure biological existence are no longer human. When people are not human any longer, the government of people and the government of things coincide. An important part of those rights that fulfill our right to life is associated with the public space and with the commons. Here I am following a definition of the commons as those tangible and intangible, material and cultural spaces, services, and goods that are essential to the full development of us as citizens and human personae, irrespective of their public or private property, and whose access must thus be guaranteed to all individuals and to the community as a whole. Since they are essential for the right to life and for the resilience of the social texture, the open access to these commons must be guaranteed to everyone in the community because they inform the well-being of the whole community. More than measures of social distancing, which stress the individual dimension of safety and the right to a mere life, here Adorno would remark that mere life is prone to be driven and controlled by any authoritarian forces that rise in the horizon. Perhaps instead of having this dimension of safety and the right to a mere life, we should reclassify any new required traits of social behavior as social caring, highlighting the force of each of us as part of a caring community. A state that cares for its people, an international community that cares for the present humankind and its future generations, a local community that cares for you should not be a matter of exception. What is striking in the reactions to the emergency devices that have been implemented throughout the whole world, both in authoritarian and democratic regimes, is the inability to observe them beyond the current moment and the local place. Only few of us understand them as signs of a longer and larger experiment in which a new paradigm of government of people and of government of things is at stake. The state of exception, allegedly determined by reasons of health security, has made citizens accept limitations of freedom that they were not previously willing to accept. This morning I was controlled by police while coming to work, and I had to justify my being in the street. Last spring in Italy, shopper bags were searched by police to verify whether or not people had got out of their homes to buy urgently needed items. Over 300,000 fines were given on this front. You see, several articles of the Italian Constitution guarantee the right to work. One of them, Article 36, explicitly states that workers are entitled to an existence of freedom and dignity. Where is my right when jobs are lost in their millions? Where is my dignity when my shopper bag is searched? In some Western countries, biosecurity has proved capable of presenting the absolute cessation of all political activities and of any social relationship as the highest form of civic participation. We have witnessed the paradox of left-wing organizations traditionally used to claiming rights and denouncing constitutional violations to accept limitations of freedom that not even fascist regimes had ever dreamed of being able to impose. Constitutional rights and guarantees have been suspended, which have never been questioned, not even during the 2 world wars and fascism. In some countries, last spring we experienced an all-day-long curfew, while even during the World War, the curfew was limited to certain hours. And that this is not a temporary situation is strongly affirmed by the rulers themselves, who never tire of repeating that the virus will not disappear in the near future. The second wave of the pandemic makes clear that the state of exception is becoming our ordinary bovine condition. You see, there have been serious epidemics in the recent past, but no one had ever thought of declaring an exception to democracy like the present one, which prevents us even from moving. We are becoming so used to living in conditions of crisis and emergency that we don't seem to realize that we are all experiencing a loss of life, that all our lives, whether we are infected by COVID-19 or not, are more and more being reduced to a purely biological condition, losing crucial dimensions, not only social and political, but even human and emotional dimensions. A society that lives in a perennial state of emergency cannot be a free society. We actually live in a European Union that has sacrificed humanity to reasons of health security and is thus condemned to live in a state of fear and insecurity, which is politically unhealthy and socially uncaring. Therefore, it is not surprising that the language of COVID-19 is the language of war. The emergency measures actually oblige us to live under curfew conditions. But a war with an invisible enemy who can lurk in any neighbor is in fact a civil war. The enemy then is not outside, it is within us. It is evident that social distancing will become the model politics that awaits us, and that this distancing will favor digital monopolies and technological devices instead of human relationships in their physicality, as we are experiencing in this very conference at this very moment. We will no longer recognize ourselves by looking at our face, now covered by a mask, but through digital devices and tracking applications that recognize biological data that are compulsorily collected. Meanwhile, universities and schools are sadly closed, and lectures are given only online. People stop meeting and talking for political or cultural reasons, and exchange only digital messages, and, wherever possible, machines replace relations between human beings. In question is an entire conception of the destinies of human society. After politics was replaced by economics, now a new paradigm of biosecurity is affirmed, to which all other needs must be sacrificed. It is legitimate to ask whether such a society and such a life in that society can be still defined as fully human, or whether this loss of the human meaning of life, of sensitive relationships, of friendship, of love, can be truly compensated by an abstract and presumably completely fictitious health security. It is important to understand that a community founded on social distancing would not have to do with an individualism pushed to excess. It would be, on the contrary, like the one we see around us today, a compact, bovine mass whose compactness is based on a prohibition, a mass wearing a uniform, a mask, a faceless mass in parataxis, one after the other, with no punctuating distinction. Nevertheless, as perhaps you still remember, people do have a face and make their face the place of their own identity and of their own truth. In their face, people expose themselves and communicate. This is why the face used to be the place of politics. Our pandemic present does not want to see our faces. It keeps them at a distance, masks, and covers them. There must be no more faces, only numbers and figures. However, what our face exposes and reveals is not something that can be said in words or numbers, formulated in this or that meaningful proposition or equation. In our own face, we put ourselves into play. It is in our face, not only in our words, that we express and reveal ourselves. The face of people, their smiles, their anger, comes before their language. if people communicated always and only information, there would never be politics properly, but only an exchange of messages. But since people have, first of all, their openness to communicate to each other, that is a pure communicability, the face is the very condition of politics, that in which everything that people say and exchange is based. It is by looking in the face that we recognize each other and are passionate about each other, perceive identity and diversity, distance and proximity. A democracy that decides to give up its own face, to cover the faces of its citizens with masks everywhere, is then a democracy that is erasing the political dimension from itself. In this empty space, subjected at every moment to limitless control, now we can see individuals isolated from each other who have lost the immediate and sensitive foundation of their community and can only exchange messages directed to a name without a face, as is the case when we lecture online and many of our students put their videos off. A democracy that decides to give up the certainty of law and of its citizens' rights is finally the terrain of Carl Schmitt's Ausnahmezustand, that state of exception which is no man's land between the juridical order and the political fact, and between the rule of law and its revocation. And finally, all over the world, we are forced to watch the sad spectacle of all these petty sovereigns, from Bill Gates to the officers of the World Health Organization, from Boris Johnson to the policeman who searched my shopper bag, who all justify Schmitt's famous definition of the sovereign as the one who decides on the state of exception. How could one of the many global viruses we have experienced in the last decades make the entire free world collapse ethically and politically? I know that some of you will hasten to reply that this is a limited condition of time, after which everything will return as before, and perhaps even better, since the virus is making the world more conscious of its environmental limits. This is simply not true, since the same authorities who proclaim the emergency do not cease to remind us that when the emergency is overcome, we must continue to observe the same directives, and that social distancing will be the new principle of organization of society, transforming the exception into a stable norm, deciding what we can do or cannot do, and revoking the principles that guaranteed our freedom and our dignity. What kind of political order can be based on social distancing? Although there are, as happens every time, those of us who suggest that the present situation can certainly be considered positive, and that new digital technologies have long allowed us to communicate happily at a distance, I do ask myself, and I do ask you, whether a community founded on social distancing is humanly and politically livable. And yet, all over Europe, we are getting accustomed to the legitimate use of emergency decrees through which executive powers actually replace the legislative ones, abolishing the principle of separation of powers that defines democracy. And it is not clear what will happen once the limit of time validity of the urgent decrees has been exhausted. In any case, what we have all bovinely accepted to undergo cannot be cancelled. What we are experiencing, even more than being an unprecedented manipulation of the principles of our democracies, is in fact a gigantic operation of falsification of the truth. We have agreed to lose the full humanity of life in the 21st century because we accept data and opinions that the media provide without subjecting them to any verification. In the last century, advertising habituated us to a discourse that acted all the more effectively because it did not pretend to be completely true. Then, in recent years, even political consensus would be produced without generating a deep conviction, somehow signaling that the truth was not in question in electoral speeches. What is happening this year, however, is something new, because now the truth is not in question even when given scientific data, which do not submit any longer to the scrutiny of elementary verification. I know I'm not the only one to note that data on the pandemic is provided in a generic way and without any scientific criteria. This is all the more surprising, since the data that would allow verification is available to anyone who wants to access it. Why is it that, even if the falsehood is documented, is it still believed? It seems that the lie is held for true because, like advertising, it does not bother to hide its falsity. As was the case for the invasion of Iraq, the war against the virus can only give itself false reasons. We are hence entering a phase of history of life whose meaning has been lost, in which truth is reduced to a moment in the movement of marketing. True is today that false speech that must be kept true even when its untruth is proven. But in this way, it is language itself, as the place for the manifestation of truth, that is confiscated from us. And our freedom is now reduced to silently observe our vicarious life as the movement of the marketing and governing lie. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Mastruzzo. Pour le moment, nous n'avons pas reçu de questions, mais peut-être en rapport avec ce que je disais en propos liminaire de cette session, pourriez-vous nous dire, selon vous, pourquoi la situation que vous avez décrite, pourquoi apparaît-elle maintenant? Est-ce que c'est purement conjoncturel ou...
I don't think that the situation is just a conjuncture. I think that some of the features that are now crystallizing into a loss of democracy and a loss of life were already present previously. If you take, for instance, Italy, in the last 20 years, the number of decrees directly set up by governments and then converted into laws by the parliament is over 95% of the whole legislative, mass. If you take the last legislature in Italy, but this is true also if you see Germany, if you see other countries in Europe, if you see even the way the US democracy is working in the last 2 decades. If you take the last legislature in Italy, you will see that not even one law started in the parliament, and that all laws were the result of conversions of government decrees. We have 60 days to convert a government decree into law in the parliament. This year, we went even further, because it is not even decrees that must be converted into law, but it is decrees from the prime minister. Those decrees have immediate effect. They have a 60-day effect, and they don't have to be discussed by parliament. They don't have to be approved. And you see, I could even understand in March, when there was a situation of urgency, that this was the case. But why is it that in November, we are still at it? And we had 6 months of, let's call it, retrieved normality to act upon it. So I don't think that this will be just a conjuncture.